Hi, I'm Michael Stittle.
And I'm Nick Nanos.
And welcome to another Trendline. In this episode, we've got the latest results from a 13-year tracking study on how Canadians view the performance of the federal government. Nick, I've had a quick look, and it looks like the kind of report card I might hide from my parents.
Yeah. Well, the thing is back in 2015, so this is a 13-year study that we do with the IRPP. And, back in 2015, when the Liberals were first elected, about 60% of Canadians thought that the federal Liberal government led by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was doing a very good job. And what you see, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, the numbers drop. So just think, 6 out of every 10 rated the Liberals doing a very good or somewhat good job in 2015. Fast forward, and now it has dropped to 27%.
Wow.
So what we've seen is a significant amount of hope for the Liberals at the beginning of their mandate, and it's kind of like every year they govern and they do stuff there's just a decline in their approval rating when it comes to their performance. And right now their performance is weaker than Stephen Harper in his last year. And his last year as Prime Minister in 2014, about 37% thought that he was doing a very good or somewhat good job, and right now 27% think that the Liberals under Justin Trudeau are doing a very good or somewhat good job. So speaks to why the Liberals are probably looking to reboot things in 2020 in order to turn that negative trajectory around, and especially since they're in a minority territory.
So one of the questions you've asked is about the performance of the federal government in terms of their international relations, which I found fascinating because we've had during Trudeau's time, he's had to deal with U.S. President Donald Trump, renegotiating NAFTA, and also China, where we still have 2 Canadians detained after the arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou. So I guess it's not going well for him.
Yeah, on when it comes to measuring kind of Canada's international reputation and whether it's improved or not improved, the first 3 years of the Trudeau mandate, 2015, 16, 17, were actually pretty decent and stronger than any of the years pretty well under Stephen Harper. But the drop between 2018 and 2019, right now only 22% of Canadians think that our international reputation has improved or somewhat improved, and basically it's dropped in half. Between 2018 and 2019, and this is what's interesting about this is, the government was able to make headway on things like the USMCA, and that being of critical importance to Canadians. But it just seemed that Justin Trudeau, on a lot of these whenever he's out representing Canada around the world, it just seems that there's always some sort of diversion from what I'll say his core mission, and these trips are just not as successful. I'm sure he thinks they're not as successful as he'd like them to be, but they're just diversions and mistakes and things that happen that undermine his ability to have a significant impact.
I find this fascinating because I remember when Trudeau was initially campaigning for his first election, that he kind of presented himself as the candidate who would reconnect Canada with the United Nations, with the sort of the global community after Prime Minister Stephen Harper had moved away from that. I think he pledged to get us back on the UN Security Council as well, and re-engage with international climate change commitments. And it looks like none of that has really had a big impact on his support numbers.
Yeah, well, it did have an impact in the first few years of his mandate. And what is fairly clear is that he's an interest. Canada's place in the world is of interest to Justin Trudeau, and it's important to him as the Prime Minister of Canada. And but what this does speak to is that just the last couple years just have not been as strong for Justin Trudeau as the first 3 years that he's been Prime Minister. So this is another thing where he's probably going to be looking to kind of turn around this trajectory for 2020 in order to move these numbers.
So you've also looked at how Canadians view the relationship between the federal government and the provincial governments, and I don't think this is any surprise that it's not so good.
Yeah, and to put this into context, under Stephen Harper, from 2007 to 2014, his best year was I think it was 2012, where 21% of Canadians thought that the relationship between the federal government and provincial governments over the past year have either improved or somewhat improved. So his scores were never that strong. When Justin Trudeau became prime minister, we saw a massive jump in terms of the improvement numbers under Justin Trudeau compared to Stephen Harper, where it went from 16% under Harper to 51% positive under Trudeau. And, if we go back to that time, there were, I'll call them friendly governments in Quebec, a Liberal government in Quebec, a Liberal government in Ontario. I put the Alberta NDP government as a friendly government to the federal Liberals. And it looked like there was a time when there was much more collaboration between the provinces and the federal government. But as those governments went by the wayside and the Liberals lost power in Quebec and Ontario, and the Conservatives regained power in Alberta, what we've seen is, that 51% positive score has dropped to 12%. Which is basically kind of like a Stephen Harper number when it comes to federal-provincial relations. And the last 2 years have just not been strong on that front in terms of the federation. Probably explains why Chrystia Freeland was put in as the minister responsible. I'm sure Justin Trudeau's hoping that she can take, the skills that she used very effectively as the foreign affairs lead and on key files like the USMCA, and to take those skills and apply them to the federation in order to move these numbers.
So I expected bad numbers from him in Alberta, obviously, and BC as well over the Trans Mountain Pipeline issue. But it looks like Ontario's not as strong for him as I would have expected. Was that a surprise to you?
Yeah, well, the thing is that Ontario is critical to the Liberals federally, but provincially with the Ford government in place, I think the negative scores pop up to around 60%. They're about 78%, I think, in the FedProv score is about a negative 78 percentage points in the prairies, but it's still fairly negative in Ontario, and I think this speaks to I won't call it friction, but the lack of simpatico, why don't we call it that, between the Ford government in Ontario and the federal Liberal government led by Justin Trudeau.
Now, if you're let's say a federal Conservative leadership hopeful and you're looking at this study, what do you take from this? What can you learn from this if you're trying to become a candidate, a leader who can, restore Canadians' opinion of the federal government and our global reputation? Well,
I think if you're a Conservative, what you want to do is to put a spotlight on the Liberals and basically to try to make an assertion that, they have not delivered on expectations, that people had hopes for Justin Trudeau and the Liberals at the beginning of their mandate, but they have not been able to deliver in terms of federal-provincial relations or our reputation internationally, or even just deliver in terms of people thinking that they're doing a good job governing the federation, and to basically say that there's another alternative. And if you're a Conservative, you're going to say, Canadians can vote Conservative, and the Conservatives will work to help, build those bridges between other Conservative provincial governments like the ones in Ontario and the Alberta provincial government and the Manitoba provincial government, and for the Conservatives to play that particular card in order to say that they could probably do a better job at trying to get, this current batch, which includes a number of Conservative premiers, to work together in order to advance the federation and to improve federal-provincial relations.
So on the topic of Conservative leadership hopefuls, just looking at Erin O'Toole and Peter MacKay, we've seen some old Conservative talking points on their Twitter feeds. I think Erin O'Toole is talking about more social conservative issues like cancel culture, which is a bit interesting. Do you think that stuff is going to engage with voters?
Well, it's probably going to engage with people that are going to vote in a Conservative leadership. And let's if we were to unpack things, think of Conservative politicians at one end of the spectrum, and just behind them would be Canadians who are members of the Conservative Party of Canada, who would vote in a leadership race. And then Canadians that are not members of the Conservative Party, but that would vote for the Conservatives, there's usually a bit of a gap where when you look at the Parliamentary Party and also the card-carrying party members of any political federal party, that they tend to be a little more ideological than your everyday Conservative voter who just tilts Conservative because they just think that it's a better choice. And this same thing happens in the Liberal Party, right, in terms of the ideology versus non-ideology. And I think what Aaron O'Toole is doing is laying out a strategy that will appeal to a certain proportion of card-carrying members of the Conservative Party, something that would also appeal to members of the Parliamentary Party for the Conservatives in the House of Commons, because he knows that he's got to win that if he's going to have a chance or have any kind of chance there to try to become leader. So I think he's doing this on purpose, and that it's very carefully thought out, and that he wants to stake out the territory as a true blue Conservative in order to appeal to the base that will be voting in the next Conservative leadership. But he's got to watch out that he doesn't go too far, because it'll undermine his ability to be politically viable if he does win the leadership, because he might be portrayed as being too right-wing.
Yeah, I should add also that Aaron O'Toole and Peter MacKay have both said that they will march in pride parades, which is a big difference between the previous Conservative Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I think this is a tip of a hat to, for the Conservatives, what they need to do. Their breakthrough has to be in suburban Canada and also among women voters. For the Conservatives to win the next election, they need to do well among men, which they usually do naturally do well among male voters, but they need to be competitive among women. And I think some of these issues, like the Gay Pride Parade, is basically issues that are more likely to align with how many women feel, and also progressive voters that might be fiscal conservatives, but they're not necessarily social conservatives. And I think, these are the type of voters that the Conservatives need to try to appeal to in order to defeat the federal Liberal government.
All right, last question for me on the Conservative leadership race. We saw over the past week, Peter MacKay had a bit of an awkward moment with CTV National News reporter Heather Wright, where the interview abruptly ended by his handlers, even though it looked like he wanted to continue.
I don't have the opportunity always to vet every single thing that goes on that social media account, so we're going to do better.
And in that,
I think we're done. Okay, so you just went way over.
I'm sorry. That's quite. He said civility. I mean,
she's just doing her job. She's a journalist.
I'm doing my job, guys.
Yeah, we've made a decision that we'd like to stop the interview.
Okay.
We kind of see this when politicians have a bit of difficult relationship with the media, with reporters. How do voters sort of see that kind of tension?
Well, I did watch the CTV interview and what transpired, and I think Peter MacKay was probably just as surprised as everyone else when his handler or communications advisor or staff or whatever you want to call them abruptly interrupted the interview. It was clear that, and I think he even said, "I know that you've got a job to do," and I almost thought that he was going to sit down and continue the interview. But right. What this does is it doesn't reflect well on him, because people wonder what type of advisors that he has. And the thing is that Canadians welcome a politician that's open and can roll with the punches, and that's not afraid and is not as contrived. And I think for anyone that's followed Peter MacKay's career, he's been a very forthright, open individual who hasn't really run away from the media very much. So this was very unlike him. But what the problem is now is that people are starting to question the competence of the team and the organization of the team who's advising him. So, I think he, assuming that he's still in as a leadership contender, he's probably going to have to look at, the type of advice that he's getting in order to make sure that he's getting advice to ensure that if he does happen to win the leadership, that he looks like a prime minister in waiting and not someone that is prone to run into controversy.
Well, that's it from me, Nick. So what's your big takeaway for this episode?
My big takeaway at this episode is looking at the long term, the 13-year trend. The Liberals are vulnerable. There's a negative trajectory. They need to turn their numbers around in 2020 because we're in a minority government. And at the same time, it's not smooth sailing for the Conservatives. They're going through a leadership. Peter MacKay's hit a few bumps, and he's the front runner currently. And the Conservatives have to do a good job. So 2020 is up in the air.
And for our listeners, if you want to read more about this 13-year tracking study that Nick did with the Institute for Research on Public Policy, we've got a lot more on our website, ctvnews.ca. And Nick, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nick, N-I-K, Nanos, or on the web at www.nanos.co.
And I'm on Twitter at Michael Stittle. This episode was produced by Trevor Coral, Jesse Taharali, and Phil Hahn. Our executive producer is Liz Travers. Sound editing was done by Jesse Taharali. This show is hosted by Nick Nanos and myself, Michael Stittle. As always, thanks for listening.